Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Kate Thomas. Kate is the K. Lawrence Stapleton Professor of Literatures in English at Bryn Mawr College. She publishes and teaches on Victorian literature and material culture, gender and sexuality studies, and on food studies. She's the author of Postal Pleasures, Sex, Scandal, and Victorian Letters, and of a forthcoming book entitled Victorian Informatics, to be published by Penn Press. She's published on queer ecology, vegetal poetics, uncanny gardens, and back to the land socialist sex politics. In 2019, she received a Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture from the American Academy in Rome, and she's currently working on a book project entitled Lesbian Arcadia, which examines the correlation of literature and landscape for expatriate Anglo-American lesbians living in Italy across the Fin-de-Siècle. And this is also going to be the basis, I think, of her talk for this evening, entitled Lesbian Landscapes in Fin-de-Siècle Italy. Please join me in welcoming Kate Thomas.
Thank you so much to Sonia for such a warm welcome and for inviting me to be part of this incredibly exciting speaker series. I would also like to thank Brandon and everybody else who has helped set up this event. And I should also thank the American Academy at Rome. Indeed, the work that I'm going to be presenting here tonight is based on research that I did in a fellowship there last year. And during my time in Italy, I actually was greatly helped by the owners of the villa that I will be talking about, the Villa Gambaraya, and most especially the director of their archive, Patricia Osmond, who is also a Bryn Mawr alum. And they provided me access to the estate and helped me use the archives there. So I'm very grateful to them, and it is a pleasure to be here. I also have a dedication. It is to Edward G. Lawson, who in 1915 received the American Academy's first ever Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture. The Academy's recognition of the field and Lawson's work together did a great deal to elevate the status of landscape architecture into greater equity with fine arts and architecture generally. Lawson, who had working class origins, became a pioneer in a field, as Professor Dumpelman said, was considered the province of the privileged. But while studying and documenting the Renaissance gardens of Italy, Lawson fell in love most particularly with the Villa Gambaraya. He made it his special example in his studies. He returned to America and took up a post at Cornell University, but after 18 years on the faculty, he was fired for his homosexuality and his career was ruined. So this is for Edward Lawson. Poised on one of the hillsides overlooking Florence and the Arno Valley from the east is a citrine-colored villa set into one of the most celebrated gardens of the Italian Renaissance. The Villa Gambaraya was built by Zenobi Lapi in 1610. But 3 centuries later, patrilineage had failed, the villa was being let out for summer lodgings, and portions of its famed flower gardens had been turned over to vegetable plots. But in 1896, Gambaraya acquired its first woman owner, a sculptor named Catherine Jean Ghica, who was also a Romanian princess. The princess and her lover, an American painter named Florence Blood, who was actually from this region, they brought the gardens back to full glory. They added an extensive water parterre, and they animated the villa with parties and house guests, making the estate a destination for both garden lovers and what several commentators referred to as a cult of women. And this is the water parterre behind me. So the villa and its gardens furnished a lesbian salon life that became famed for its theatrical and sexy parties. One story tells of a party entirely of women assembling by these reflecting water pools. The sun set, the shadows of the flying archways moved across the lawns and gardens, and the guests looked up to see the princess appearing on a flying archway, illuminated by the last of the sun's rays, naked, they say, except for 3 glittering rubies, then suddenly disappearing down a hidden spiral staircase to re-emerge beside the water parterre and waft among a throng of guests. Now, this story is most likely apocryphal, but the hidden staircase is real. And even as a fabrication, the story is very telling. By figuring the princess as a naiad, by dramatizing disappearance and reemergence, it shows us that these 2 women used their garden and its architecture to project what I'm calling a lesbian Arcadia. An Arcadia, of course, is an actual mountainous region in Greece that has become a mythic space, a space shaped by poetics, expressive of rural contentment. And the Gambaraya starred as the backdrop to the betrothal of the most iconically contented lesbian couple of the early 20th century. Gertrude Stein visited the villa in 1908 and while there proposed marriage to Alice B. Toklas. This Italian Renaissance estate had found new life at the Fin-de-Siècle as an expatriate lesbian Arcadia. So I have a few pictures of Stein and Toklas. Sadly, these first 2, they are in a garden, but it is not Italy. This is actually their estate in France, in Billignan. But I wanted to show you just sort of how embedded they are, how allying, how much they are allying themselves with the landscape, with garden here, quite formal gardens here, and also with sculpture. This last one, I don't actually know where this is. It's undated and has no place. But you can tell here just how intimate the landscape and the garden life is to their relationship. So retracing the lives of the Princess Kika and Flowblood does present a methodological problem. As with many of history's lesbians, we have almost no documentation of them in their own words. But it is my contention that we can catch sight of them by studying the garden that they chose to, quote, lovingly restore, as a contemporary account phrased it. I'm working from an understanding, enabled by geographers like Gillian Rose and theorists like Bell Hooks, that landscapes can be both desired and desiring. And I'm headed towards a new proposition, which is that the Fin-de-Siècle garden was as formative for lesbians as the closet was for gay men. As queer theorist Eve Sedgwick taught us back in the 1990s, the closet is a space that hides but also reveals you, a place where something can be hidden but be, quote, ever liable to come into view, and ultimately is a place of coming into being. It's a description that reminds me of the work of geographer J. Appleton, who devised a theory of prospect refuge desires, to think about environments that make people feel safe. And definitely part of my aim, and why I'm so happy to be part of this series, is to encourage the scholarly fields of landscape architecture and gender and sexuality studies to be in conversation with each other. Actually, the very first documented use of the term sexuality refers to the sexuality of plants. It actually comprises the first 6 entries in the Oxford English Dictionary. And without a doubt, Renaissance and 18th century garden designers thought about erotic pleasures. But I think despite that, there's still a slightly shy relationship between the 2 disciplines. Most work, I think, in landscape architecture and sexuality focuses on urban spaces or the public sphere. And indeed, the most recently published reader on landscape studies doesn't actually have an entry on sexuality. But landscape architecture and sexual identification must be theorized together. Listen, for instance, to how writer and gardener Vita Sackville-West articulated her own passionate attachment to landscape. In a 1948 letter to her one-time girlfriend, Violet Trefusis, she wrote, "It was a queer feeling, almost as though I belonged there. I can't enlarge on this even to you. It is too private a feeling. It did, however, make me realize that curious bond between us, our intense sense of the character of places. We both have it so strongly that it becomes a pain." This is a kind of love letter with two addressees. Vita is writing to her girlfriend saying that their bond, which can be named, is due to a yet more primary love of landscape, which is a love that cannot be described. Vita's words teach us that we can read the Princess and Florence's loving embrace of the Gambaraya and their dedication to and identification with the garden as itself a lesbian formation. Lesbians, if they have been admitted to exist at all, have long been figured in art and culture as the apparitional, to use Terry Castle's term, or the uninvited, to use Patty White's. This image here is one I found in the Gertrude Stein archives at Yale. It's a very playful photograph that Florence Blood sends to Stein. And you'll see that Florence has handwritten the words, "my shadow," under the image. And as a shadow, she leaves an imprint on a stucco wall and maybe also melds with or even grows out of the grasses at the foot of the image. And she looks a little like the vine leaves hanging over her head. On the one hand, she doesn't quite appear, but on the other, she is thoroughly incorporated, blent with the material world. And given that photography is a technology of the capture of light, what we're seeing here, what Florence was seeing and what she invited Gertrude Stein to see, is a witty amalgamation of nature, culture, human. Stein would later describe the shadows, quote, "outside of you and inside of you," as the thing which you must express in your writing. And I think this is a photograph of how, as literary critic Timothy Morton puts it, nature with a small n does not uphold regimes of insides and outsides. It's also a photograph that forms one half of an artistic correspondence. Florence is sending it to Stein, who 2 years earlier had written a sort of equally elliptical pen portrait of Florence. So Florence styled herself as a shadow. And her partner, the Princess Gika, who was a recluse, styled herself as a ghost. This is a very rare photograph of the princess in her garden. You can see she's sort of veiled and draped. And what written descriptions we have of her, especially from her later life, are from guests who really only caught what they describe as spectral glimpses of her by the pool at dawn or half lit as she passed by a window. Now, in literary history, my primary field, a remarkable number of the stories about lesbians are also stories about ghosts. Most of the scholarship on this phenomenon focuses on lesbians haunting the houses of the heterosexual family. But I'm arguing that the ghostly or shadowy lesbian takes on an interesting cultural heft when she appears in a garden. In 1962, landscape architect Russell Page called gardening an art of fugitive pleasures. And fugitive is a wonderful word, right? It derives from the Latin root meaning to flee. And as a verb, it is suggestive of both exile and evanescence, but it also leans towards the noun which grows from the same root, refuge. It's a term that has recently become important to Black studies via the figure of the fugitive slave, who defies white ownership by fleeing to spaces that have disabled structures of white ownership. So Saidiya Hartman, Fred Moten, C. Riley Snorton, among others, they've all taken fugitivity as a central trope for both their archive and their method. And Monique Allerwert's work confirms fugitivity's strong link to landscape and ecology. Those very subjects who are often written out of landscape traditions are hardly, she writes, indifferent to them, but instead most immediately affected by them, their, quote, knowledge of the ground, a matter of life and death. Plantation spaces claimed to possess those who traversed them, but self-authored transplantation used landscape to refuse the Anglo-American belief that the Black body could be a thing possessed. White planters tried to turn the botanical against the Black body, not only breaking it through forced harvesting of crops of sugarcane or cotton, but obliterating it from view by planting lines of fir trees between the main house and the quarters of the enslaved. But the nature of the botanical is that it can turn and turn again. It can be fugitive within itself, and enfolding of the fugitive subject, ushering it into new life forms. Caribbean poet, philosopher, and critic Edouard Glissant writes that even the ball and chain gone green, rolling on the ocean floor, folds the history and artifacts of slavery into the time of oceanic drift and vegetable growth. Black literary modernists have been powerful theorists of the revivalist power of landscape for marginalized subjects. Writing at the turn of the century, African-American lesbian poet Angelina Weld Grimke, here she is, looked to a time when, quote, when the green lies over the earth, to imagine the singing of a same-sex love song. And to recall a dead lover to her, she subsumes herself into a landscape architectural. Quote, I stood again within the garden old. It is the power of this exact stance to evoke a lesbian erotics that I wish to explore today. I stood again within the garden old. Remembering that Renaissance already means rebirth, a Renaissance garden revived at the Fin-de-Siècle is then a medium that simultaneously expresses cultural longevity. It reaches further back even than the early moderns who first dug its foundations because their designs were interpretations of classical ideals. But it's also ephemeral. Flowers will die, hedges will overgrow, pools dry up. Sexuality is also a fugitive thing. It's not, writes the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, a question of being this or that sort of human, but of becoming inhuman, unraveling your body's human organization, exploring this or that zone of bodily intensity. Sexuality always flees from our definitions, changing across the span of a minute or an hour or a lifetime or an episteme. And because I want to take this concept of the fugitive as a kind of ethics, I should warn you that my paper will not be sort of pulling back a biographical curtain to reveal proof of the nature of Princess Gika and Florence Blood's relationship, nor even to decode the design of their garden as fixedly lesbian in meaning. We might feel that desire to make the women appear fully to us, but we've already been taught by Florence that a shadow on a garden wall is the way she wanted to be seen. And to confirm the importance of this fugitive mood for the lesbian gardener, let me give you another example. Gertrude Jekyll, who has been described as one of the greatest garden designers who ever lived, as influential as Capability Brown, visited and loved the Gambaraya. This is a, quote, portrait of her, painted by William Nicholson in 1920. Jekyll's biography is sort of routinely described in that echoing phrase, she never married and had no children. The only terms biographers have for her are those of negation, non-existence, and lack of trace. And indeed, most of Jekyll's over 400 gardens are now lost to us. But I love how this painting takes absence and makes it expressive. This is, if you like, a character study sans character, suggesting that Jekyll is best found not in a frame, but in the land that she works. And apparently Nicholson had precious little choice in the matter. Even though Jekyll herself had trained as a painter, she was entirely impatient with the process of sitting for him, and she kept running off to the garden rather than turning up for their sessions. So this is all he had left of her to paint from. But she was also a designer who relished lacunae. Here is an example of how she incorporated them into her garden designs. This one is at Hestercombe Gardens in England. The Princess Ghica and Florence Blood had met in Paris, but it was in Italy that they chose to set up their home and, more importantly, their garden together. Why Italy? Now, many expatriate artists and authors settled in Italy in the 19th century, and many of them were nonconformist in terms of their gender and sexuality. It's something we can trace back to the 1850s, when American actress Charlotte Cushman set up a salon for what she called jolly female bachelors in Rome. And since then, Italy had really been a destination for spinster and lesbian artists. When the early 20th century novelist Daphne du Maurier slept with women, she called it going to Venice. It was a private code that drew from a deep cultural well in which Italy was seen as a land of sexual adventure generally and homosexual license specifically. The author Henry James conflated love for Italy with love for other men in an 1884 letter to John Addington Symonds, who was a scholar of the Italian Renaissance, who's now recognized for having written one of the very earliest defenses of homosexual love. This is James writing. I nourish for Italy an unspeakably tender passion. James then proposes that he and Symonds share this inclination. You, he writes, are one of a small number of people who love it as much as I do. Now, the it here refers to both Italy and homosexuality, and James concludes the letter by suggesting that, quote, victims of a common passion should sometimes exchange a look. There's a good deal of scholarship on the particular affinity gay men had for Italy from the 18th century through to the mid-20th century. It actually seems that it was sort of a rite of passage to tour Italy and fall in love with a gondolier. And some even bring back their gondolier. But nobody has noticed so far that a huge number of lesbians were A, in Italy too, and B, using very similar language about it. Nita Sackville-West, for example, was bowled over, subjugated, inarticulate with love for Italy. This inarticulate love was also physically ecstatic. She writes, I am shivering with excitement and joy at my beautiful, beloved Florence. Can we say that figuring yourself as besotted by place, by land, and figuring that place as your beloved was an expression of lesbian identification? Literary critic Jonathan Goldberg says we can. Writing of Willa Cather, Goldberg points to, quote, an identification between heroine and land that is a same-sex desire and that stands for the thing not named. Similarly, being speechless and ecstatic in the face of Italy's beauty and history allowed gay and lesbian artists to apprehend a set of homosexual feelings for which they felt there was neither place nor language at home. Now, a phrase has probably already popped into your head, the love that dare not speak its name. The phrase is famous because Oscar Wilde cited it in 1895 in the first of his 3 trials for gross indecency. Quoted in a courtroom that then led to a jail cell, it is easy to forget that the line comes from a poem by his lover, Alfred Douglas, and that the setting of the poem is actually a garden, a vaguely Italian garden full of pallid youths, marble, and bunches of grapes. Here it is. The narrator is entranced by this garden. Gazing, I stood long, all mazed, to see a place so strange, so sweet, so fair. He is mazed by the Arcadian landscape, just as Symonds, Sackville-West, et al. Described themselves as speechless. So the phrase, the love that dare not speak its name, became code for how morality can crush love, but in its origin, the poem imagines a garden as a place where the nameless desire can, in fact, come to flower. We find the same word, unspeakable, in a description of the Gambaraya made by the art critic Bernard Berenson, who lived in the neighboring villa of Itati, which is now a research center owned by Harvard. The Gambaraya, part of which you see here, is, he writes in 1896, he says it has an unspeakable beauty. A long, level lawn behind the house ends in a parapet, which as you approach it seems to frame in the world's end and heaven's beginning. Berenson loved the Gambaraya, but was completely baffled by the women who owned it. This is what he has to say about them. The Princess Ghika was a narcissistic Romanian lady who lived mysteriously in love with herself, perhaps, and certainly with her growing creation, the Garden of the Gambaraya. With her was an American friend, Miss Blood. She painted not too well. Yet it was she who copied Cézanne to such perfection that it made me wonder. I did not make love to her. As I look back now, I wonder whether she did not resent it. I recall outbreaks of hostility on her part for no accountable reason except nerves. Okay, Bernard. So what accounts we have of the princess do emphasize, like Bernard's, her mystery, her reclusiveness, and her so-called man-hating. Florence was more outgoing, many people say more flirtatious. But of course, what's striking about this passage is that both women are out of reach to Berenson. The fact that the princess and Florence reject him, he can hardly believe it, renders them unintelligible. They are, quote, unaccountable, narcissistic, mysterious. And what specifically confuses him are the sightlines of their desires. He has to, quote, look back at Miss Blood in order to fantasize that her absorption with her painting was frustrated fixation on him. And the princess's gaze is turned inwards toward herself and the garden with which she is in love. Berenson's aggrieved heterosexual plaint, in other words, points at the same erotic model I've been describing, female desire that is oriented toward both women and landscape. If Berenson held no appeal for the women, their garden had a ghostly power over him. For years, he writes, Gambaraya remained one of the haunts of my life. To explore the idea of the Gambaraya as a haunt, we can place Berenson's description alongside the writings of another hillside neighbor, the aesthetic lesbian writer Vernon Lee. Lee was an accomplished art historian who developed a psychoanalytically informed theory of empathy. Lee also knew a lot about hauntings. She wrote supernatural tales of wife murder, and she slept lifelong under a photograph of her dead first love, Annie Meyer, by which I mean it was a post-mortem photograph of Meyer dead in her coffin. Very cheery. Lee lived just a 3-mile walk from the Gambaraya, and she was a regular guest of Florence and the princess. In 1912, she offers the opinion that old gardens like the 300-year-old Gambaraya are not haunted by, quote, whole ghosts of ladies and cavaliers of long ago, but instead by certain moments of their existence, certain rustlings and shimmerings of their personality, their waywardness, momentary transcendent graces and graciousnesses, unaccountable wistfulnesses and sorrow, certain looks of the face and certain tones of the voice, perhaps none of the steadiest, things that seem to die away into nothing on earth, but which have permeated their old haunts, clung to the statues with the ivy, risen and fallen with the plash of the fountains, and which now exhale in the breath of the honeysuckle and murmur in the voice of the birds, in the rustle of the leaves and the high invading grasses. As you can see and hear, this is all one sentence. Lee's grammar is breathless. And her metaphor in this passage is of breath that's been held, but can now exhale. This breath is composed of what is wayward, transcendent, and unaccountable, what is, in other words, fugitive. Lee detaches the garden from the heterosexual romantic form of ladies and cavaliers, and indeed from embodiment at all, instead diffusing romance into the gestures and the very forms and textures of the garden. She orients herself towards the past as if to find kinship with other people, but then she demonstrates herself kith with things other than people. For me, this resonates with the turn that theory has recently made via new materialism, which proposes that the material world is not a dumb witness to human desires, but stands in a relation of intimacy with us. And perhaps, like any deployment of the word new, the new of new materialism should be taken with a grain of salt. If we look back to the work of ecologists like Aldo Leopold, we'll find in 1949 his essay, The Land Ethic, describing a biotic community of which man is only a member. And he himself is taking that term biotic from zoologist Carl Moebius, who had coined it in 1877. So when we come to some concept like Donna Haraway's concept of nature culture, it might be saying a bit much to say it's new, but I don't think we should get hung up on this either, because I think there's a lot to be gained from how the ideas of these scientists are currently being re-articulated by thinkers in the humanities. Matter has memory. Things have agency. Plants are sentient. Thinking without a head is how philosopher Michael Marder describes it. Vibrant matter is the term that political theorist Jane Bennett has coined to describe how material things are not inert, but instead have what she calls shimmer and spark. And most excitingly, these new materialisms have already begun a dialogue with queer theory. When we examine the environment, it shimmers and figures emerge in a strange distortion, writes Timothy Morton in his Manifesto for Queer Ecology. So now we've heard three writers, Morton, Bennett, and Lee, reaching for that very same word, shimmer, to sort of spring us free from the monopoly that humans think they hold on the organization of the world and on liveliness itself. Shimmer is a word that means the play between shadow and illumination, light that is flickering or tremulous, capable of casting new forms and relations. It's a word that recalls Florence Blood's photograph of herself as a shadow and Princess Geeka's design choice of a water parterre garden with pools that work as a series of animating reflective surfaces. A garden is not made, but is instead always becoming. It is in flickering motion between hard and soft surfaces, built and planted elements that are all always in states of growth and decay. Some elements of the garden will last for centuries and others for less than a season. So to return to when Henry James and Symonds don't name their own sexual subjectivity, but instead share a look, or when Sackville West and Trefusis share a love for place that makes them shiver. Hopefully you can see now that this is not so much or not only a moment when they are repressing themselves, but it is instead a sort of expansive and expressive queer modality, more akin to the way that plants and ghosts communicate. So, turning from how people talked about the garden, I'd like now to explore the ways in which the Princess and Florence's restoration of the Gambaraya estate might be said to express these lesbian modes of attachment and tactility. What did they see in the garden and the villa that made them make their home there? What aspects of its design seem resonant with their lesbian ownership? Let's begin with the question of orientation. Queer theorist Sarah Ahmad has taught us to give equal attention to both the sexual and spatial meanings of this word, challenging us to ask how sex and space work together. This scholarship shows us that a sexual orientation is also a spatial orientation and vice versa. And a spatial orientation can make one feel queer. And the orientation of the Villa Gambaraya is slightly odd. This is actually a plan that you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner was drawn by Edward Lawson in 1917. Now, architect Judith Kennard has noted the curious, what she calls the curious formal structure of this house and the unusual relationship of house to garden. She also can't tell which way the house is facing. So here in the middle, wait, maybe I can do it with my pointer. Yes, I can. So this is the house in the middle. So this is the water parterre, obviously. The Arno is over here. And what Judith Kennard is saying is she can't tell which of these doors is the front door of the house and what the orientation of the house is. And she points out, she's done studies of other Medici villas in the area, and she says this is completely different. This is a completely different orientation, and also the emphases on the front door are missing. So looking at those similarities between the long elevations, she says this creates a tension between two possible readings of front. Now, whenever I teach queer theory to students, I cite Eve Sedgwick, tracing the etymological root of the word queer via the German quer, meaning transverse, and the Latin word for twist, and the English word athwart. So Sedgwick's already acutely spatial sense of how queer has an affinity with that which is skewed is very well illustrated by the Gambaraya. Most villas in the region are oriented with their main door opening southwards onto the view of the Arno, but the Gambaraya is torqued 90 degrees off axis, so that its main doors face instead east and west, and its main axis does not line up with its main entrances. Local historian Alessandra Marchetti has observed that this design allows the sun to rise in one room and then sweep through the others one by one across the course of the day, and she says making it again unique to the region. The water parterre garden, you can see, is offset. As a result, not one sightline dominates. And to enter the house, you must first encounter several garden spaces. One upper floor bedroom even has a direct route into the garden via that spiral staircase that is concealed in a flying arch. The central courtyard, also unusual for villas in the region, is small and shaded. Rather than centered and held, one feels moved through and out again. And if both doors are open, the villa has a through vista, garden leading to garden, leading to garden. In her study of Vita Sackville West's home at Sissinghurst, cultural historian Alison Oram points out that Sissinghurst's domestic spaces were eccentrically dispersed too, and that to get from a kitchen to sitting room or from one bedroom to another involved walking through the garden. Now, both Vita and Harold had multiple gay extramarital relationships. Their marriage was as open, in other words, as the architecture of their house. They encountered the garden far more than they encountered one another. Now, Gambaraya does not have that degree of disassociated architecture, but it is an architecture in which the outside is found on the inside, its inside is an outside. The garden embraces the perimeter of the house and then pushes up through the center. Harold Acton, the gay writer who lived at the neighboring villa of La Pietra, now owned by NYU, described the Gambaraya's grotto garden as, quote, one of the prettiest open-air boudoirs imaginable. His word boudoir is at once coquettish and as coy as the closet, of which it was the architectural ancestor. And Acton's meaning is clear. Outside-in bedrooms, bedrooms that are gardens, and bedrooms that let out into gardens. These are spaces that have and give expression to erotics, and erotics of the greenwood, as novelist Ian Forster would later put it. The division of the Gambaraya gardens into small, distinct rooms was one of the features most praised by Edith Wharton in her 1904 book, Italian Villas and Their Gardens, and was likely copied by Vita Sackville West at Sissinghurst. Vita described wanting the, quote, more intimate surprise of small geometric gardens opening off long walks, rather as the rooms of an enormous house would open off the arterial corridors. Her word intimate matches Acton's term boudoir, and the idea of enclosed sections of gardens as rooms was a Renaissance concept. In the Renaissance pleasure garden, these themed and highly textured distinct spaces were designed to proliferate styles of encounter, both between humans and the landscape, or between humans, landscape, and mythic women. Gambaraya's Nymphaeum and what, since the 18th century on, was affectionately called the gabinetto rustica, and actually the word gabinetto translates as closet. These two spaces are of particular interest to me as places of encounter and texture that have historical and material alliance with female forms. Typical to nymphaeums and grottos of Renaissance gardens, the Gambaraya's nymphaeum and gabinetto rustica are heavily decorated with rocaille, which means rockwork, and another material called spugna, which architectural scholar Alessandro Carlino describes as being comprised of, quote, effusive eruptive rocks, such as pumice, pyroclastic sedimentary rocks, such as tuffs, and above all, vacuolar sedimentary rocks of chemical origin, such as travertines. What this means is that this material is highly porous, with recognizable fossilized botanical and animal matter. It is a material then that displays deep time, the locked embrace of life and death, and it marks, if you like, a seizing point between the animate and the inanimate. It also compels you to run your fingers over it. It makes a kind of haptic invitation. Literary scholar Jeffrey Cohen describes this kind of stone as desiring. It expresses, he writes, matter's queer, inconstant, and promiscuous desire to affiliate with other forms of matter, regardless of organic composition or resemblance to human vitality. So spugna is a material that kind of kaleidoscopes and then displays other lives, other life forms, and above all is formed by metamorphoses. Stone is slow water. Stone is thick with sedimented time, writes Cohen. But you may object. These materials and styles are common to Renaissance garden designs. Giorgio Vasari, after all, includes 2 chapters on how to make grottos in his treatise on technique that he appended to Lives of the Artists that was published in 1550. And the presence of rocaille and spugna at Gambaraya predates its lesbian owners by centuries. And in fact, the only design we know, other than the water parterre garden, but the only other design that comes from the princess's own hand was this pebble mosaic that's adjacent to the space she called the agora, which is the Greek term for the main square of the polis. So, if this is the only thing she made, how then can I make a reading of these textures as having a lesbian inflection? In part, I can answer this by referring to modern queer culture's long relationship with salvage, citation, impersonation, pastiche. The women's restoration and reanimation of these Renaissance designs is a citational practice. They were, we could say, lip-syncing the Italian Renaissance, which was, in turn, mimicking the poses of the ancients. Lesbian poets at the Fin-de-Siècle were turning to sapphic fragments onto which they grafted their lyrics, or were reviving dormant French and Italian poetic forms. So lesbian restoration of a dilapidated garden that had been fashioned from ruined materials seems like a very similar exercise in adhesion and amalgamation. But I also have another architectural analog that I think illustrates how these materials and textures can invite lesbian attachment. I'd like to introduce you, if you haven't met it already, to a house known as Alarand. It's an 18th century, 16-sided house in Devon, England, designed and built by the cousins and lovers Jane and Mary Parminter. They built it after 10 years of travel together on the continent, and they wanted their home to reflect the architectures they had enjoyed during this time. Most particularly, Alarand shows the influence of the chapel of San Vitale in Ravenna. The Parminters also chose a design that allowed them to move from room to room throughout the day, following the course of the sun exactly as it does at the Gambaraya. Alarand also has a frieze entirely made of feathers. It has 476 locks, some to doors that can only be opened from one side, and some that are on tiny Alice in Wonderland-like doors in the floor. These are architectural details that take the tensions between freedom and confinement of being a woman, of being an unmarried woman, of being a lesbian, and make them three-dimensional. Such designs readily invoke metaphors about mobility and immobility. The astral body of the sun moves across the sky, as do the avian bodies of birds on the wing, until those wings are plucked and glued, perhaps, to the ceiling of a dining room. But above all, they are designs of tactility and texture and iridescence. And this incredible house is topped with this. It's a gallery of which the walls are entirely and lavishly embedded with shells that the Parmenters collected on their grand tour. And literary scholar Lisa Moore has written a wonderful study of the 18th century sister arts. I'm much indebted to her, and not least for her emphasis that literary and landscape arts used to be considered to exist hand in hand with each other. You can't read the 18th century and not understand that these arts were considered equal to each other. And Moore has traced how the collecting of pebbles and corals and shells was really something of a lesbian hobby. Shell collecting, she shows us, was an 18th century craze, pursued largely, although not exclusively, by women. And shell collecting, Moore points out, is this sort of excellent wheeze for women who wanted to spend hours and hours and hours alone together. And as a building and design material, I think shells are also a good metaphor for women's constrained potential. And they were also often regarded as looking feminine, admired for what art historian George Hersey calls invaginated spiraling. Remarkably, the Parmenters attempted to ensure that their house would be inherited only through a female line. They willed it to what they called unmarried kinswomen, an attempt that makes it likely that their choice of decor was trying to express a feminine eternal. In the case of the Villa Gambaraya, Princess Gika and Florence Blood didn't design their house and garden from scratch as the Parmenters did. Like hermit crabs, perhaps, they chose a dwelling made and abandoned by others. But selection and restoration are also acts of desire and design, a way for lesbians to retrofit themselves into history and emplacement. So I think we should read the geologics of Spunya of the Gambaraya and the shell gallery of Alarand together. Immortality through landed inheritance was, of course, denied to 18th and 19th century women who could not own property or whose reproductivity under patriarchy serviced male names and male estate. So garden walls of collected limestone concretions and seashells therefore held out the thin but tactile possibility of landed lesbian immortality, inheritance without dynasty. I've brought us to the utopian potential of Italian lesbian gardens at the Fin-de-Siècle, but Arcadias always have a sinister side as well. And although the pastoral might be, as David Shuttleton writes, a homoerotic genre, he cautions us that it nevertheless constructs identities within existing, often exploitative, hierarchies of social class, gender, and ethnicity. And many scholars of landscape architecture will tell us that garden pleasure has always been the preserve of the powerful, for those that held title over goods and life, and that garden culture is class privilege. Without question, the characters I'm exploring occupied a socio-economic continuum of privilege. Moneyed and mobile at its more modest end, aristocratic and feudal at the other. Rita Sackville-West, who in 1926 writes a book-length Georgic poetic celebration of the Kentish landscape where she settles, called simply The Land, said of herself that she was, quote, at heart, nothing but an old Tory squire. I'm, of course, interested by her cross-gendering of herself here, but it doesn't mean I can ignore the fact that her queer attachment to land serviced a ruddy continuation of landed gentry property relations. The Anglo-Americans who settled around Florence referred to themselves as a colony. And if their style of colonizing seems benign, more like a long stop over on a grand tour or the dallying of ants on a picnic cloth, we should rethink. Italy's mesogeia system, that is to say, its practices of sharecropping, did not fully end in this region until several years after the making of new contracts was outlawed in 1978. Anglo-Americans may have come to Tuscany in search of freedoms, but it suited many of them that they found peasants there as well, indentured peasants. And if they weren't in active search of a new feudalism politically, they were still in search of it aesthetically. Vernon Lee, for example, who reads Marx, tries her best to extend her principles of empathy to the lower classes, ultimately, I think, still needs Italian peasants to stay in the background as decoration. And for some of these members of the leisured class that had bought up Italian gated estates to turn them into a theme park of the past, as Harold Acton put it, that past not only included serfs, but its future included black shirts. The director of the British Institute that was established in Florence in 1917 was, for example, an outspoken supporter of Mussolini, as was Sybil Cutting, her daughter Iris Arrigo, and Carlo Placci. These people were friends with the Berensons, with Vernon Lee, and with Florence Blood. So as we explore the way that the hills of Florence furnished its expatriate community with artistic and sexual freedom and styled it out of their fantasies of Arcadian bliss, we must also recognize how membership of this hillside colony turned for some into support of the colonial campaigns of Mussolini in Africa and elsewhere. Et in Arcadia ego. This same phrase, et in Arcadia ego, tells us that gardens accept tensions and paradox. Arcadias are imaginary, mobile places of shifting lights and shadows, deep and fleeting timescapes, desires and designs that always have to be made and remade. Arcadia's geography is one of yearning more than finding, writes Tennis Cosgrove, or I might translate, shimmering more than appearing. I'm going to leave you with this photograph. It's of the grave of Florence Blood, which I took on a very rainy day during my research trip there. She's a figure of almost complete historical obscurity. She died 94 years ago, and yet, as you can see, someone had left 2 red roses on her grave. I don't know who. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Kate,
you.
for this wonderful talk. Can you hear me in the back? I think then we can even do it like that.
Lovely. And if you need a microphone, there is one we can hand around.
We have some time for questions.
I should mention that the Villa Gambaraya is up for sale. So if anybody has, I think it's like $100 million, just let me know. I'll put you in touch with the owners.
Maybe so I'm very curious. It's somewhat of a boring question. I feel after that's really
no such thing.
fascinating and wonderful, and I'm still kind of hearing the words ring in my mind.
Thank you.
So I'm curious to learn more about the owner's insight into the architecture that they were buying, and whether there's any information that you were able to find in the archives, how they. So what is it they actually knew about the architecture? I mean, were they, because they obviously chose that particular land and architecture that was already in place.
Yes.
Yes. And then went there and restored part of it, but also changed some aspects, added new things to it. Was there a possibility to deduct basically from the archives what they knew, how they went about that process?
It's a great question, and sadly the answer is we have pretty much almost nothing to go on, no kind of documentation. Not only, I'm not sure whether it would have existed in the first place, but there was a huge fire at the villa in the wake of the Second World War, and any kind of estate records that were extant were lost during that time. So we really have sort of nothing to go on except these kinds of refractions through other accounts at the time. We do know that this particular villa was a choice in the sense that, you know, this was an abandoned region, right? So this the hillside around Florence, and it's only about, 30-minute bus ride now from Florence, and there were many empty, derelict villas. So we know that this was a sort of selection, but we don't have any trace, sadly, of their kind of understanding of what they had been left architecturally, or what kinds of interventions they were making. So we have to read only through these refractions, and we don't even have, Princess Gika was a sculptor. Well, her sculptures are not there anymore. We have maybe we do have one portrait left of her that we think perhaps was done by Florence Blood, but that's sort of it. So in terms of any written record, really nothing. I in the archives, all I could read were a sort of almost commonplace book that Princess Gika had kept, but it was quotations from other things she had. It was like a reading journal. So it didn't have any reflections at all upon the building or the grounds or what they had selected to do. No, she was very admired and respected by gardeners in the region for what she had done. So I think there was a sense that she had a real feeling for the spirit of the place. But that's all we know.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, and maybe we can talk afterwards about them also, is that a number of Italian landscape architects, some of the first professional landscape architects in Italy then in the 1930s, actually were inspired by what they produced.
Yeah. Yes.
And then took it as a model.
That's right.
That's
right. That's right. No, that's why I love, say, having the voice of, say, Edith Wharton in here too, like to understand that this garden that, as I say, is perhaps on the verge of becoming derelict again, was just so inspirational for Jekyll, for Wharton. It was this sort of, mecca really for so many gardeners and landscape architects, and we sort of don't visit it. So you can visit it, and I encourage people to visit it. It's absolutely stunning. But yeah, it's this sort of origin story for so many, and yet we know very little about it.
Dave, thank you so much. I'm partly just sitting here trying to metabolize this rush of images and words that you've given us. I totally hung up on spugna.
Yeah.
I've never heard the word before.
Right.
I love the way that you juxtapose it with the shell gallery as these sort of twin portals to a kind of deep time and maybe a kind of retrojection to a lesbian property condition. They also seem like really different portals, don't they?
Right.
So,
yeah.
The shell gallery is so taxonomic.
Yes.
The shells are all kind of grouped together.
Yes.
And they're very decorative.
Yes.
And there's something about that spugna. It seems that I would love to know more about where it's gathered from, but it just looks like fossils scraped out of the same multi-species sort of, petrified charnel house or something.
Yes.
It's anti-taxonomic. It's anti-decorative.
Yes. Yes.
So I wonder what happens if, having thought them together, we also sort of think about them as two quite different paths.
Yes, I agree with you. I can really sense that too. Like you're right that one of them is, the shell collecting is much more like the pressed flower, kind of collection. It's got the arrangement. It has a much more sort of, it has more propriety to the because of its connection to the feminine arts. Whereas I feel the spugna is so raw, is so hewn out of the earth. It has got this very kind of primal kind of feel to it, and is resistant, I would say, to the kind of collecting and arranging. And you're right, the kind of the bird's wings like glued to the ceiling, the shells embedded. I mean, it's a turning of the vegetal animal world into the kinds of regularities of patterning and so forth that Spunya just seems to fully resist, right? Although as soon as I say that, I mean, of course, that image I had of the Gabinetta Rustica, that is what is happening there too, amazingly, like sort of geometric patterns there. Yeah, I like holding on to that sort of them being slightly aslant to each other, and I'm not sure exactly where that would lead me, but I like it. I think you're right. I think it's I mean, and even Alarand, I mean, it's so geometric, it's so regulated, it's very quaint, it's got a jewel box like quality to it, outside and in. And I think that's a pretty different project from these sort of grand vistas of, you know, the Arno and the grotto dripping with, you know, moss and water and so forth. And you know, and Alarand doesn't succeed in holding on to it. It's now a National Trust property, and the lineage fails. The female lineage fails within a couple of generations. But yeah, I'll think about it. I agree with you. I agree with you. Different textures. Yeah.
Yeah, I just was thinking in your research, did you find, because you were saying that this Spunya was there before
Yes.
I was just curious, is that the material that they used to build the grottos in Atlas?
Yes.
Did you find any passages like describing the Spunya that you were able to derive these maybe other more queer narratives out of? Or because it is a really weird material.
Yeah.
And I just think there's a lot of depth if you hear more about it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's like, let's have more on Spunya. I like, you know, I think, because also it's like, it's related to, I mean, we all know travertine, right? So travertine seems the much more sedate, like relative, but it has a similar, apparently, you know, sort of geological construction, right? I mean, so vegetable matter that rots and leaves those sort of pock marks and so forth. So, I mean, yes, I think there is, I mean, Vasari, right, does write about this material. So he's not theorizing it as queer, but, you know, but I think there is more material out there to be found about how people are feeling about the use of it with such a wide application too. I mean, it's like making these, yes, grottos, but then, you know, these insets as well into like the Nymphaeum as well. So, you know, obviously I was reading it through, you know, Jeffrey Cohen's very new work on stone. But I'm sure you're right that if I go looking for more accounts, you know, from the sort of 16th century on of how people are representing that material, it could be a really interesting, you know, a really interesting sort of plumb line through, cultural plumb line through to it. So yes, I will go, and I promise you, I will bring you more Spunya. Yeah, me too. You know, I was very lucky in Rome. I was working, you know, alongside sort of archaeologists, and there was actually a specialist there who was working on tuff, which I understand now is different from tufo. Anyway, so he was very helpful in, you know, just sort of talking with me about the character of this material. But yeah, I'm sure that there's more description out there that will yield good things.
And they're right at the beginning of the landscape architecture.
Wonderful.
Learning and wonderful opportunity to hear about all the different layers and how we construct landscape, what landscape tells us about society at large, politics and culture. But there are some kind of movement. That was moving. Maybe one. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was just curious about your time at the villa, and if you could just speak a little bit just about your experience and just what it felt like to be in the garden in the house and what that was like for you on this.
Oh, what a lovely question. It's a very uncanny experience to be there because so the villa is owned by this wealthy family who bought it in the mid 20th century, and I think rented out for society weddings and so forth. So it is this strangely emptied space again. And I was just incredibly lucky to, I literally emailed the director of the archive out of the blue and said, "Are you still the director of the archive? And you're a Bryn Mawr alum, and do you mind sort of, us working together on this?" And she was very gracious about it. And the most exciting thing for me was when she put me in touch with the local historian, Alessandra Marchetti, who had grown up in the village. And so she had this sort of sense of like, she knew the family of the gardeners, who were the gardeners for the Princess and Florence Blood. So she had this incredible sort of intimacy of those who worked the land. Whereas the family who own the villa now, they want to sell it. They don't really live there because they're renting it out all the time. So it was incredibly strange to be sort of intersecting with some of the same kinds of, social structures that have meant that these kinds of, villas and estates have sort of so readily run, into the derelict state. So it was beautiful, and I could be there I was there at dusk, so I could see exactly how the light was working then. I was there on my own with Alessandra, and so that was very special and really extraordinary. I mean, Alessandra told me, her grave is Florence Blood's grave is still there, but some of you may know in Italy the tradition actually is for graves only to stay in place for a short while, and then they get dug up and replaced. So I still don't understand why Florence Blood's is still there. Alessandra didn't know either, and she didn't know who put the flowers there too. But my sense was that this, that you still had these same social structures, sort of remnant social structures around, so that you could sort of feel back through time to the person who grew the roses at the time when Princess and Florence Blood were there. And in fact, there were some plantings around the graves and graves alongside Florence Blood's that were from the family who were the caretakers of the grounds. So that was fascinating, very evocative. Yeah, it's a nice question. Thank you.
One more question.
Yes.
The relationship between literature and writing and architecture and landscape. I'm wondering if you could elaborate even more as it relates to the Villa Gambaraya.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so as I was intimating, it's a lost association, right? So in the 18th century, they are arts that are considered to be, hand in hand with each other. At the Fin-de-Siècle, you have, I think, these kinds of that has been forgotten, but then you have these, sort of revivals in the sense of just affiliation, I would say. So, Princess Gika's commonplace book was full of literary quotations. The parties that they hold there are literary salons. So everybody sort of wants to come and be, part of this kind of milieu of artists and writers and gardeners, and you just find them in the same place as each other. With Vernon Lee too, she is at home writing about gardening as she is about aesthetics and art history, and then she turns her hand to fiction as well. So it's just sort of seen as it's a replacement of culture, and obviously I think that's part of this Anglo-American sort of move to go over to Italy in the first place, is a kind of reaction against some of the things they see going on in American politics and economics, frankly, too. It's like it's a good cheap place to go and get a whole dose of culture as they see it in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so it's this sense of like, yes, put these things back together in a social form, the salon form, which is obviously something that's also going on in Paris too, already. And you know, Gertrude Stein is in Paris, but her brother lives next door to the Gambaraya. So Leo Stein has the villa next door to the Gambaraya, and so basically there's a sort of everybody who's anybody in the literati like come and visit, and it's got that kind of you know, sense of a refuge, I suppose, and sense of somewhere stimulating.
Well, thank you so much.
I don't want to like correct me if I'm over-extracting, but you mentioned that the villa at this time with Florence Weitzman
That's right, Geeka, Princess Geeka, yeah.
When they bought this house, that there was a lot of derelict villas.
Yes.
And I was just curious, like, did you find a sense of like a haven in these like derelict properties? Like, did you see that in parallel with any other times when like there's like a haven, so like
Yeah.
like more like outwardly
Yeah.
refuge areas?
Yes.
Did you, I guess, did you see any other like artists attracted to these like derelict spaces that maybe had these kind of like identifications?
Yeah. Yeah.
In your reading of that?
Yes, it's another great question, because for sure, there's a lot, you know, homosexuality is not illegal in Italy, which surprises people because they say, oh, the Catholic Church, the dominance, like, what's up with that? But, you know, Italy's law was based on the Napoleonic Code. It wasn't outlawed. Actually, women had some interesting property rights too, that so meant that it was structurally set up in such a way that it could become exactly, as you say, a haven or a refuge. We definitely have that sense in the 1850s salon in Rome with Charlotte Cushman. We have all kinds of interesting women. She basically recruits people to come out. She recruits lesbian artists. She recruits, there's an amazing Black Ojibwe sculptor called Edmonia Lewis who goes out to Rome, and she says, I'm never going back to America again. The race relations in America are horrific. I'm staying in Italy. So it was in the way that we understand, like, say, Paris of the, early 20th century being a haven, right, for Black Americans and for, queer writers and so forth, that Italy was doing that in the 19th century. And it just sort of shifted. I would say the emphasis shifted from Rome, actually weirdly also after Italian independence, to Florence. So there was a little bit of a kind of migration of the energy of the country, but 100%, yes, you have accounts where people are openly describing the haven-like capacities of this country, and the access to art gets spoken of in the same breath.
I guess kind of a related. Sorry.
No.
Related question, but I was really struck by your description of kind of particular queer affinity for landscapes in general and Italy specifically on the one hand, and then the note that you ended on in terms of like a lot of these people's relationship to fascism. And I guess I'm curious about whether you see maybe a connection or a through line to this particular concept of a landscape with national character, like the idea of this idealized Italy in like the queer imagination and in the fascist imagination, on top of the sort of economic and property relations that you named that also make these lives possible.
Yeah, oh my goodness, yes. I think you're exactly right that it can if I say land can turn and turn again, you can easily find, right, a sort of horribly shared ground in the sense of that which is sort of natural or pure, or like the nostalgia. This is a nostalgic project that I'm looking at, right? A queer nostalgic project, but we all know that like that plays such an important role too in fascism. So I think yes, there is horribly uncomfortable ground. Just as I'm a 19th centuryist by trade, and so understanding like the sort of you know, a figure like Cecil Rhodes, for example, as, you know, that producing we have to produce an understanding there of like homosexuality and, you know, colonial land practices being absolutely entwined. And so, yes, I think there is this through line, and, you know, I was doing it obviously by just sort of gathering the characters, but I'm sure you're right, we could do it too by sort of going in and analyzing. I bet it's around like, you know, nostalgic appreciations of the landscape, or a landscape that, you know, hasn't been sort of turned to, you know, certain kinds of ends, but can be, you know, have lovely peasants here, there, and everywhere as you march through it, basically. So yes, I'm sure we could do it narratively too, descriptively too.
Thank you very much for taking that.
Thank you. Thank you.